I'm pretty excited to be in Costa Rica. It's my first time here traveling to this beautiful nation. This nation is also home to one of the few blue zones in the world, where they measure a larger number of people over the age of 100 as a per capita society. So there's plenty of things that I can learn here too, outside of set, that'd get me pretty excited as well.
Yeah, putting together the cast for this was about telling that story of what's now possible. And so there's two major components to that. The first is that we don't have to get diseased and sick and old and weak as we age, and that the longer we stick around, the more technology that is here to help us live longer, healthier lives. So by combining experts on lifestyle interventions and examples of how those lifestyle interventions can really move the needle on our health and help us stay healthier for longer, that forms one major component. The second part is looking forward into the future, what's coming down the pipeline, the new technologies, the new research, the new science that's proving we can have longer, healthier lives, even beyond maybe our wildest expectations.
There are so many key insights that I learned yesterday that I took home with me, but overall, it's really exciting, and it can be sometimes overwhelming because the field of longevity is so vast, but it's also so deep. And yesterday just really demonstrated that there's so much information out there for people to utilize, which is fantastic. Because for someone who's maybe just starting, there's so much things that they can do right off the bat. But for someone who's been really focused in on optimizing their health, improving their health span, you can continue to go to the next level and go deeper and deeper and deeper. There's essentially like almost no end to it. And that's what the big takeaway that I had from yesterday is that there's so much that people can do should they want to pursue that in its highest degree.
Health span versus lifespan. We've got this topic we've introduced so far, but we haven't defined it as well as we would like. And Rudy, I actually wanted to start with you. Let's talk about, to the audience, what health span means. This is an interesting concept, obviously it has to do with health, but what's the span part? Define it for us.
So health span can mean a number of things for many different people, but ultimately it's focusing on your healthy years that you have control over, free of disease, free of ailments, where you're really living your best life. And if you can take it a step further, it's really being able to do the things that you enjoy doing the most. For some people, it could be something maybe not as a hardcore, so to speak, as like performance sports or doing Tough Mudders or doing these obstacle courses as you get older. It could be playing sports with your grandkids, kicking the soccer ball around outside. And for some people, it could be I want to compete in Ironman triathlons until I'm in my 70s. So health span ultimately is focusing on avoiding disease and really managing your health from an optimal perspective. But when you go the step deeper to the degree, it can be very personalized as what people expect out of that health span.
That brings us to then the counterpoint. Like, what is lifespan versus health span? They both have the word span in there. Rafid, I thought maybe you could give us some thoughts around the difference between those two terms, particularly talking about lifespan.
Yeah, different but related. So when we talk about lifespan, it's not so much quality of years or quality of life during those years, it's how many years, right? So it's extending your overall longevity in life. But if we're being honest, when we think about what is a life worth extending, it's a life that's worth living, right? And that's defined by this health quality that you have. And the two are related in that we know that these chronic diseases, which 75% of the world succumbs to, right? It's chronic disease deaths, is ultimately related to lifespan. So the goal is to shorten that delta as much as possible. So we really want to not just live long, but live well, right? And closing that delta and closing that gap is really the primary goal of us at Cenegenics and really anyone who's trying to pursue the longevity pathways.
Right, so you're mentioning this term, a delta, a gap. You're really referring to a difference in numbers, right? So as an example, someone might live till they're 90 years old, but they've spent the last 15 years of their life being unhealthy with chronic disease, not enjoying their life. They've got a pretty big gap versus closing that gap. Maybe they only have 1 or 2 years of a chronic disease before ultimately they pass away. And this gap is something we know we can begin to close. And that sits right at the heart of the mission of Do Not Age, which is to extend healthy lifespan for as many people as possible. This is something you think about every day, Alan. Talk to us about that gap.
Yeah, so I think for us, the difference between sort of health span and lifespan is with a healthy lifespan, that's how many years you're living, whereas a lifespan is just how many years you're alive. And those two things are very different, right? And so just the same as Cenogenics, what we focus on at DoNotAge.org is closing that gap. So we've got as many healthy years as possible because nobody wants to live with morbidities, right? That's not what everybody wants to do. So that's what we focus on.
Yeah, and morbidities being those chronic diseases, yes. Being unwell, having those conditions that really compromise our life. And in terms of what we can do with health span, there's a number of things we've begun to discuss, particular to lifestyle factors. And we know some really interesting things about how we can extend our health span with a lifestyle-based approach. And Alan, you've actually listed off a few of these in your previous work. Could you do that for us now?
Of course. So I'm looking at things like supplementation, sleep, movement, and just to be clear, you don't have to be perfect on day one. This is a journey. I'm still not perfect, and I've been at this 4 years. Every single day I live it. So I don't think anybody's going to be perfect on day one. It's about their health journey, and it can be something as simple as, from a movement perspective, taking a walk every day or every morning or getting into that routine. In terms of sleep, using blue light blockers before they go to bed to help them get a better quality of sleep. Supplementation, starting on some of the anti-aging supplements that are now available. So there's all these different things you can do, and they're very basic and very easy changes to make. So what I want to try and convey is the fact that it's not that difficult to get started and make a big impact.
Right, and so in terms of health span, things that are actionable right now, one of the ones you mentioned was physical activity. Now, Rudy, obviously that sits right in the realm of expertise for you as VP of Performance Health. You've been in that space for a long time. You certainly walk the talk. We've seen that here on set. Tell us what we know about health span and physical activity.
So physical activity is so critical. And again, it's variable from one person to the next. It's closing the gap on that delta, right? So the way we kick off physical activity, a needs analysis for patients, is to identify their VO2 max at baseline. So once we identify their VO2 max, we get a ton of different data. And what a VO2 max does, it essentially looks at how well your heart, lungs, and muscles work together during levels of exercise. And we take our patients up to those peak levels of exercise, see how the heart actually performs under that stress. Now, everyone feels the same when they do a VO2. Everyone's going to get to a level that they cannot sustain. They're going to feel like they failed, but that's the whole purpose of that test. When we look at the data, we get to look at the heart rate and what's occurring when they're going through their different levels of metabolism, transferring over what's called your aerobic metabolism into your anaerobic metabolism. When you get up to those high intensity zones, we actually see a lot of positive metabolic things occurring as far as respiratory exchange ratios, CO2 production, and so on. So everyone's going to have a different point in which that occurs, and it's going to be tagged with your heart rate. So all of our patients actually have cardiovascular programs based on their personalized data. So if someone's going to start in zone 2 walking, for example, because they don't have a pattern of exercise established yet, we're going to use those heart rates in those lower aerobic metabolism zones and prescribe that for their goals when they're walking. But for someone maybe like you who is doing sprint interval training, we're going to say, all right, Nick, when you get into 180 beats per minute, that's when you tap into that anaerobic metabolism. That's when you're going to spike up your growth hormone levels. You're going to improve your insulin sensitivity over time. This is what we're going to do, and you recover at maybe 12 beats per minute to 20 beats per minute. So your rest periods need to stay pretty short because you're a very fit guy. So everyone gets that personalization, and the VO2 is what we track repeatedly over time so that all those efforts with physical activity are used to establish these outcomes and to achieve these outcomes.
Right, so you've defined this concept of using metrics
Correct.
to know where we sit in our health span future and how we might shift that. So in particular with VO2 max, we know some really interesting things about health span, about sickness, and how that relates to lifespan. In fact, it's one of the best predictors of lifespan.
Yeah, many call it an additional vital sign to identify what are risk factors for early mortality and also cardiovascular events.
All right, and Rafid, pulmonologist by background, certainly you have some things to say here. VO2 max, it's a new concept to many of the viewers. It's going to be this test where you've got a mask on, we're looking at your oxygen exchange at peak exertion. But why is that so important in terms of our longevity?
Well, I mean, I think we kind of touched on it, but the answer is it directly impacts all-cause mortality, right? So, you're seeing the net impacts of this on all of these, as we discussed, all the chronic health ailments that impact health span, right? Which all of those essentially ladder up to impact your longevity and your lifespan. So when you have this one lever that you can pull, a VO2 max, and really training well, that's the impact. It can't be understated, right? So the impact on mortality across all causes, not just cardiovascular, is quite dramatic, and that's really kind of one of the take-home points that we always push with all of our patients is being conscientious of that as you call it, the additional vital sign.
Brilliant. And before we move on to that, let's just briefly define. You mentioned zone 2. This is something that people really need to know about for their health span because they need to be working in that zone. And for most people who aren't exercising a lot, it starts with vigorous walking. How do people know they're in zone 2 without doing anything too fancy?
So essentially, if you can go for your walk, and if you have a partner, and you can talk in somewhat of a conversation, but it's uncomfortable, like you'd prefer maybe not to talk, that's going to be your zone 2. It's something you can sustain for longer periods of time. With your aerobic metabolism, it's something you can do for a long duration. So you shouldn't be going so fast where you stop after maybe like 10 minutes, like I can't do this. It should be something that you can sustain for maybe 20, 30 minutes, or even longer if you really needed to, even over hours. But a good gauge for people from a respiratory perspective is that if you can talk, but not at the level that we're talking right now, it's more forced, it's maybe more uncomfortable, and maybe you say like 4 or 5 word sentences. That's going to be a good zone 2 to try to maintain. When you get up to your anaerobic metabolism, in contrast to that, that's where you hear audible breathing. So like say for example, the escalator at the airport is broken and you have 2 carry-on bags you're carrying and you have to take the stairs and you're late for your flight. You sprint up those stairs holding those 2 bags, you get up and you hear yourself huffing and puffing and breathing. That's when you tap into that anaerobic metabolism and your CO2 production is high. So it's very different as far as the levels of difficulty.
I'm super excited about longevity for a variety of reasons, right? The first is that I work in critical care, so that's the intensive care unit. So I'm seeing a lot of patients that are, their issues are, unfortunately, they're already there, right? And it's very hard to unwind once you've had late stage illness, right? And I see the regret on a lot of their faces when I talk to them about these preventable measures that they could have taken for years and years. And so I'm excited about that, and I want to share that message with as many people as we reach, right? That living a healthy life, not just a long life, but a healthy life, is absolutely attainable, right? And it's not just attainable to the millionaires and billionaires. This is something that all of us can do in our daily living and make the quality of life better.
All right, guys, so you've learned so much at your time here, but also at Cenegenics with your team. But we wanted to get a little bit of a resistance training workout in, just as a reminder that exercise doesn't need to be complicated. It certainly can be complicated, and gyms that are widely available can make things very easy to do and jump into certain equipment you like. But that doesn't mean it's impossible to do when we are even on location, filming our docuseries here today. So we're going to go through some primary movements that are beneficial for everyone to incorporate, and those are going to be a horizontal push, we're going to do a vertical push, a horizontal pull, and then we're going to do some lower body work, meaning our squat and also a hinge pattern. Then we'll do some additional work through the driveway that you guys can utilize these water bottles for. So, you guys ready to go through some exercises?
Let's do it.
All right, you look ready. You got these arms going. All right, so the first one we're gonna do are push-ups that I know you guys did when we were at Cenegenics Miami for your testing. So I'm gonna have you go down into a...
So my biggest message for people from this series is to understand that you don't need to hit a home run with all of your longevity efforts all of the time. Small things, small ripples, make very large waves. And if we can learn and teach the specific changes that can, really impact our longevity and our health span, like improving our VO2 max, our cardiopulmonary health, or managing our visceral fat levels so we're not driving up inflammation, or how we manage our glucose levels and our insulin response. Just those little things that we can do every time we sit down at a table to eat, or when we decide to, be active or engage in exercise, that we can start to implement day over day, over the period of weeks, months, years, decades. All that is adding essentially like health in your health span bank, so to speak.
Thank you for sitting down to join me. I'm really curious to have a discussion with you about the demographics of longevity. Now, you're the author of the book, The Super Age. You're the founder at Human Change, a strategic thought group advising businesses on the changes that are coming because of longevity. And what I've heard from you is that the evidence for living longer, healthier lives, it's already in the data.
Yeah, it's baked in. We have more people over the age of 65 now than at any other point in human history. And in fact, by the end of this decade in the United States, at least 1 out of 5 people will be over 65. That is a real revolution. But that just leans into the longevity side of things, the fact that this many people are living longer. We're also hitting a point just a few years later where there'll be more people over 65 than under 18. We're having fewer babies too. So a lot of the different math around demographics is changing, and it's creating a new future for us, and one that we need to pay attention to today in order to reap the most benefits out of it tomorrow.
Right, okay, and so this is a big picture shift
Huge
that's
shift.
occurred.
Huge.
Of course, you also understand some of the mechanisms behind the why that this is happening. Share us a few key pointers around why this demographic shift is happening.
You know, this has happened in waves, and every time there's been an extension of longevity or a decrease in birth rates, there's been a great leap forward. And we can tack all of these to the Industrial Revolutions, of which there have been 4. The first one in the US around the American Revolution in the 1700s. The second one just after the Civil War, the Industrial Revolution, which most of us identify with as the Industrial Revolution. The third happened in the 1950s, more of an information and scientific Industrial Revolution. And then the one we're in today, which is the Information Age. And each one of these has caused a massive shift in how we live, how we operate, and how we reproduce. And the interventions that have happened at each stage have really considered what human life is, which I think is a really cool component of it, because for most of our history, we lived to be 30 or 35 on average. And this is going back, 30 million years. Like, we really lived short lives for the most part. But vaccines came along, clean water came along, sanitation came along. All of these things kind of were the building blocks of getting us forward. And of course, public policy, things that allowed people to, rather than go to the factories at age 6 or 7 or 8, to at least get to 14, like my grandfather before he entered the mills. But then you add that scientific component onto it. So you've got social, scientific, diet, all these pieces. And then you get to what we have today, which is the reapings of all of our investments and the fact that people really are living longer. But it's changed the life course too. And this is the part that people struggle with every day. You hear young people talk all the time about how hard it is to buy a house today. Well, that's because there's so many people still living in their homes. They've paid off their homes. Most of their wealth is in their homes. These are the boomers in our country and the silent generation. So younger people are putting off many of those milestones that they would have had in a traditional 35 or to 40 year life expectancy. They're pausing on having children, getting married, and buying their first home and making major decisions until later in life.
Right, so I really hear in that the story of technology shifting the mark in terms of lifespan at a whole. A lot of that shows up in the very earliest years of life. Babies making it through childhood, led by vaccination, antibiotics, pasteurization, the increasing availability and dissemination of those technologies. And some of the ones you've mentioned haven't even actually made their full impact yet.
No.
Clean drinking water, clean breathing air. There's a lot of disparity still in terms of the uptake of that. So we're likely to keep seeing the average lifespan shift longer based on if we stopped everything we have today.
Well, yes and no. These are investments that are critical investments that we've made as a civilization. There are places where clean water isn't fully accessible like it used to be, places like Flint, Michigan, that struggle with getting clean water to their residents. Not having clean water will negatively impact your life expectancy and the life expectancy of the people that live within that region. There are huge gaps in life expectancy worldwide, and there are huge gaps in life expectancy in the United States. I live in Washington, D.C. There's a 25-year gap between the poorest person who lives in Washington, D.C. and the richest person, and we're not the worst off. Chicago, 30 years, and it takes 8 miles to go from the highest life expectancy to the lowest life expectancy. Nationwide, if you look at the reservations where the indigenous populations live, life expectancy is as low as 54. 54. That mimics sub-Saharan Africa. But if you go to the East Coast and the Research Triangle of North Carolina, you'll find towns with life expectancies of 97 now. This is at birth. So there's quite a bit that we can do to close that gap, but we have to make strong public investments to make sure that that happens.
And in terms of that continuing narrative around making those investments, these technologies that have changed things a lot over the last 150 years, what are we on the precipice of now?
I think we are in a place where our current healthcare system, at least in the United States, isn't fully delivering for its citizens. We live in somewhat of an institutional model still, a brick and mortar model, where people have to go to a place to get care. But I think we're in a period of evolution now around healthcare in this country. I mean, I wear a device that measures my outcomes, measures my daily measures of my heart rate, my EKG, my ox levels, et cetera. That's revolutionary. When we get to that point where we move away from the fully brick and mortar into a more virtual way of giving care, this data will automatically upload and I'll get automatic feedback on the things I can do better to sustain my life and extend my healthy years. If there is one thing that we know is consistent in this world, it is change. And if we understand that constant, that change is always happening, we just have to look for the signals that point us to where we're going. There is a positive and a negative side to everything, everything. The negative tends to happen when we don't act. The positive is when we do. And a lot of this is in our control. As you say often, it's not our destiny, but it can be if we don't move.
And in terms of landing on that end mark
Yeah.
there, you at a personal level,
Yeah.
how do you feel about the next 10, 20 years?
You know, I think that humanity is actually really resilient at the end of the day. I do think that the next 10 years are going to be the most difficult that we will experience in our lifetime because change is happening at such a quick pace. There's great wealth disparity, there's this great shift in our total population. There are, of course, geopolitical threats that seem to be knocking at our door every day. The next 10 years, though, as we go through this big piece of disruptive demographic change, they're going to make people uncomfortable, and people are going to be a bit scared. But keeping a North Star and knowing where you want to go is one way to get you through it so it doesn't consume you.
All right, so it sounds like some faith in the adaptability.
Oh, I have plenty of faith.
The adaptability
of
of the
faith.
human race and our resilience.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah, we just have to see what the future might be. And the future can be really positive. You know, I say in my book, last sentence is, the future may be gray, but it's incredibly bright. And as we get older, as we live longer, there might be more older people than at any point in the history of the world, but that doesn't mean the lights go out. That means that we're just entering a new period of our civilization.
We have many experts in the show, but also we have two guests, and it was very, very nice to see how they intermingled and that there was friendship growing, I thought, next to exchange of lots of thoughts and really giving the knowledge to our guests. We also thought, okay, we are really growing as a community, and I think this is so important that this series, Reverse Longevity, is being broadcasted, because here you really see that what we tell might be very valuable for the much broader community, for you as a listener.
The key insight that drops in for me is that we really have consensus from a variety of experts, people who are running companies in the longevity space, and even our guests, with this idea of the longevity future being now. It's no longer something that's 10, 15 years away. We actually now, without a doubt, have the ability to help people live 5 to 10 years longer in a healthy state. All right, biohacking is a term we're hearing more and more in the longevity space. And I love that I get to sit in this segment with you, because I'm going to say right up front, I'm a biohacker. And I want to give us a definition to play with here on what I think biohacking is, because it's a bigger, broader definition than most like to take. So I believe that biohacking is any individual who is using their own biology for self-experiments, where they're measuring their biology, they're coming with an intervention, coming with a change, and measuring the after, the before and after, giving us data, being a self-experiment. All right, so this is not about implanting devices in your hand. It's not about going to the absolute fringe and doing things that are crazy, like injecting yourself with gene editing. This is a broad definition that our audience can join us in on. And I'd like to say up front, I think that by the end of this, a few of you might join me in saying you're also a biohacker too. I'd love to see that happen. But before we go any further, let's hear what you think about that definition, Rob.
Yeah, I think it makes sense, and certainly in the longevity space, because there's so much we don't really know, there's a real opportunity for people to look at things, use pharmaceuticals that are maybe approved by the FDA but off-label for another indication, or try diets, try exercise regimens, and look for the response in ourselves. I think that's something that we're naturally curious. If we're curious about our longevity, we have the mindset for longevity. It leads us right into personal experimentation, which by your definition is biohacking.
Thank you. I tend to agree. And so then I wonder if at your daily work, if you're biohacking everyone you work with by that definition.
Well, I mean, by your definition, I think we are, right? Because when I think of the N of one of studying in a biohacking sense, really it stems from this idea of progress, right? We all of us humans, since the beginning of time, have tried to evolve and progress and push the needle forward, right? So that's what we're doing in the N of one kind of setting with biohacking, and that's actually what we do with our patients at Centogenics. We do personalized care, and I use the analogy of like this is if you're anyone who plays an instrument, if you're classically trained, that's you follow the very strict rules. But if you play jazz, that's when you deviate, right? And it's a little bit of jazz. That's what we're doing here. And last time I checked, jazz wasn't bad, but it's also not like it's not for everybody.
Andrea, our scientist.
I love jazz, by the way. So in that definition, yes, I would agree. Everybody is biohacking, because what your definition is really looking at yourself, a response. You're measuring it again if you're feeling better, for example, and if you have better mood, and say, yes, I biohacked myself. But I think it's a little bit semantic. So I would say if you are really trying to invest in yourself, you are not a scientist, you're not a physician, and you're experimenting with your body, I would say extensively, for me, you're a biohacker. But once again, it doesn't really matter if one is a biohacker or not. I think most importantly is how much risk is a person wanted to do? How much evidence does a person want to have to expose your own body to something which you invent, which might not be proven yet?
Okay, and then that's exactly one of the places, Rob, you're just alluding to this, that longevity as a field finds itself. So, for example, a lot of the supplementation that's available on the market, we only get data from rodents. We get it from animal models. Maybe we get some early stage data in humans, but we don't have that rigor of science that we might desire for a clear-cut answer. Yet many people around the world are reporting some incredible benefits, including myself, from taking supplements. So there's a bit, again, of the jazz, the art, and the science of longevity here that I believe biohacking plays a really important role in. And Rob, you work a little bit with that art yourself in your own life. You've shared with me that you take rapamycin. You've not received an organ transplant, to my knowledge. That's its on-label use, right, to suppress the immune system, but it has some other benefits that many in the longevity community are quite interested in.
Yeah, rapamycin's a fascinating drug. It's arguably the single most powerful longevity drug, at least from the animal studies, but the human studies are few and far between. So, but the interesting thing about rapamycin, it's a molecule that's very targeted. It turns down mTOR, a sensing protein that has a lot of longevity benefits potentially. The interesting thing about rapamycin is that although it was only discovered 20 years ago, it's used in millions of patients every year. There are broad FDA indications for, as you mentioned, organ transplant rejection. It also happens to stop cancer. So there are, metastatic renal cell carcinoma is an indication for it, and several other cancers. It also happens to slow cardiovascular disease. In other words, when you coat stents in the coronary arteries, there's an FDA indication that rapamycin keeps the atherosclerosis from reforming there. And there is evidence in animal models that rapamycin actually has an effect on Alzheimer's disease, to the point that University of Texas and others are now doing rapamycin studies for Alzheimer's disease in humans. But the results aren't in on that. But the point is, rapamycin, unlike some supplements you mentioned, has been broadly used and is continuing to be used in millions of people around the world every day. So we know the safety profile in humans already. The question is longevity and the longevity benefits. Specifically, it's prescribed by a physician, so you need to get it for your doctor's order. And unlike the renal cell transplants or the immune suppression doses, the longevity dose is different. You take it once a week, and that so far, at least, people have have very, very little side effects from it.
Interesting. We're into the art space because we don't have the science. And Andrea, I can see on your face you want to respond. Bring the science.
Bring it on.
Yeah. I would not agree that it's without side effects. No drug has no side effects. But we have a little bit more than 10 randomized controlled trials. So randomized controlled trials in human means that you have a group of individuals and you give either one group a placebo or the active component, in this case, rapamycin or Rapalox. So, and if you're looking at human studies and you're excluding the ones with heart failure, et cetera, who are getting a stent, but you're just looking for indication for longevity, then the evidence, I would say, is quite poor, except of there might be a positive effect on the immune system and there might be a positive effect on the cardiac system. All other organ systems are either neutral, so there's no effect in the randomized controlled trials, or it has not been measured. So there are a couple of trials now ongoing, which hopefully will give us the answer if we are also mice, because we saw that you really gain longevity, also not only in terms of lifespan, but also health span in these mice experiments. So there are lots of studies going on to really prove if it is effective.
Yeah, longevity, to your point, is very difficult to prove in humans. The studies are difficult to do, and with rapamycin, we're really lacking. The thing that appeals to me about rapamycin is its specific targeted action on mTOR, and we know that mTOR, when it's turned up, drives inflammation, drives hyperfunction, and that's another discussion. And when it's turned down, when you turn down mTOR with drugs like rapamycin, you turn up something called autophagy, which destroys senescent cells. You turn down inflammation, and all these factors. At least it makes a sort of an intellectual model of, you can imagine how it would have a salubrious effect on longevity for all the major diseases, as well as the phenotypes of aging, wrinkles, and we know menopause. You give animals rapamycin and their fertility extends.
Absolutely.
Their
we
menopause
don't
slows down.
disagree. So I think it's a beautiful molecule which needs much more research to give much more widely if it is effective, clinically effective. Absolutely. That's the reason why we have so much research now to actually say, yes, what kind of milligrams, either daily or weekly, could actually help to improve the health span and the lifespan in humans. And it's, I think, quite likely that we have the biomarkers already to prove that it helps. So we already have proof a little bit in the immune system. So now it's really taking it a broader way and including more individuals.
Go ahead.
But that's the reason why we're also doing a study at NUS as an issue.
Absolutely, yeah.
I'll tell you though, I think you're getting to the crux of the issue of biohacking versus kind of broad acceptance, right?
Yes.
And you've already mentioned this idea of a randomized controlled trial. So obviously in the medical community, we need robust data before we can make a recommendation. And so when we have these trials, we're talking hundreds, if not thousands of patients. And very commonly, it is thousands of patients. And we need that many so we can get a variety of patients, so we can make broad general statements. So the problem with biohacking, of course, is that when you have an N of 1, all I know is Rob's physiology and Rob's body and Rob's response to whatever the intervention is. So, and my personal views, candidly, are, I think it's very promising, rapamycin as an agent. And we've used it. I come from the lung transplant space. We use it quite a bit. Actually, you missed one indication for lymphangiomyelomatosis, which is
green now.
Yeah. I mean, it's amazing. So, all that being said, that is the limitation, right? And I totally get that we see nice signal in animal models, right? And I agree with you, but we cannot responsibly just hang our hats on that. when we know that the annals of medical history are filled with promising drugs that never made it out of animal trials.
I think that's such a great point, and it frames this whole discussion about biohacking versus society-wide public health recommendations. Because we're not at the point where we can recommend drugs like rapamycin for longevity. The data's not there. On the other hand, me and you and you and you, we're all getting older every moment, and we're slowly dying. Longevity is 100% fatal disease, right? And I'm willing to take the risk personally of taking, for example, rapamycin, and maybe there are some untoward effects, and maybe there's some unknown effects, but I'm willing to take those unknown risks against the certainty of death, which I'm looking at, and we're all looking at through longevity. So, but that's the biohacking ethos as opposed to the public health recommendations for everybody.
There's an action bias there, right? Which may or may not be to your benefit.
True.
So that must be considered as well. So.
Yeah, and I like that because that's your individual choice. You have the knowledge what rapamycin does also in your body. You are measuring it, and you are feeling better. So, and you would have a consequence if you would have lots of side effects to stop it. So it's very important to have that knowledge component if you're saying, I am a biohacker.
Sure, that makes,
And we've actually raised two really important points here. One is that the science would like to see something much more clear. If we did all that work now, we might have a solid answer for rapamycin in 5 years, 10 years. That's a long time for someone like myself or for Rob to be content to wait when we start to see promise. And the other point that you raised, Rafid, was the N of 1. If we know in the biomarkers, in the data, that it's looking good for Rob to be taking that as an entity, as a biological experiment himself, there's a lot of argument for him to make that I'm going to continue to do that. And that is, again, the essence of biohacking, a before and after data point. Knowing the risks, knowing the expectation of what you think you can get from it, and self-experimenting to have the answer. Should I keep taking rapamycin?
Yeah, but I want to flag one thing though. I mean, look at this panel here. By the way, I love being the dumbest guy in the room. But,
I think you're Switzerland. You're very neutral here.
But when we think about analyzing this data, everyone in this room has significant requisite knowledge about the basic science to make these assessments and make these decisions. I'm not so sure that the average layperson, when I first started picking up scientific journals as a medical student, hell, it was a challenge to say the least, right?
It takes days to read.
Yeah,
yes.
exactly. So I think you're creating this ridiculous burden of responsibility for the patient who's just the layperson doesn't have a scientific background, which speaks to the importance of the idea of shared decision making. Because there is acceptable risk, right? And this exists in therapies that are FDA approved, right? Shared decision making should be a foundation of every doctor-patient relationship, right? And so my personal view is I'm not against rapamycin. In fact, I'm looking at doses and what I would take, et cetera, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend it to my patients without having a very long conversation, right, about the risks and benefits and fully disclosing where it's at in the context of its evolution with the data.
One thing that keeps coming up for what I really learned was the mindfulness and the social aspect of longevity. Just the purpose in life, finding that purpose. There's so many aspects to it, but that is one of the keys, is finding your purpose, finding your why.
Actually, as far as the whole process, of aging or living longer, I did not realize how much of it was mental versus what we were eating, what we're doing, the activities, whatever. I did not realize how powerful the mental aspect of it was, and it's unbelievable.
Let's begin sitting nice and tall with the hands in front of the heart. And a nice upright spine, but not uptight. So please relax your shoulders, relax your lower jaw. Just taking a moment here now to connect to your breathing. As you just begin to observe the quality of your breath this morning. Feel the coolness of your inhale coming in through the nose, and the warmth of your exhale. And just settling down onto your mat and maybe set an intention for your practice today. or maybe think of 3 things that you're truly grateful for.
Right, and this is something that you work on day to day. You're working with glycan age, you're helping people interpret their results, and you're really developing a clear understanding of the role of nutrition in improving that measure of biological age. So we know there's a connection between longevity and nutrition. Could you just give us a few of those high-level points that you're observing about improving glycan age with nutrition changes?
Yeah, well, this is a very interesting area, and glycan age is one of the tests that we can use, but we can also use other ones, for example, microbiome testing and some pieces of blood work that we can, draw from, for example, liver or kidney tests, and we can combine those metrics in personalizing the nutritional approach. Generally, I think most of the people are not doing what they're supposed to do with fiber and protein, and those are the first 2 points that I assess and look at and optimize, and we can do a lot with just those 2 for the beginning, and then expand on this proper base.
Okay, and can you observe improvements in
yes.
glycan age just from those changes?
We can observe improvements in many different factors. So, for example, on certain like glucose metabolism points, and microbiome is very responsive to these kinds of changes. So I can give you an example. I had a client recently who had elevated inflammation in the microbiome and infection rates in the microbiome, which came from yeast overgrowth. And he also had signs of like early insulin resistance. So we did a rigorous change in his diet and put him on a lot of fermented foods first, to kind of introduce new inhabitants into the microbiome, and then afterwards we increased the fiber intake, and we also optimized the protein intake according to his age, his exercise level, and so on. So with that, we actually targeted insulin resistance. We wanted to control that first, but as a consequence, his microbiome followed and changed. We managed to boost the varieties of the microbiome, which improve the insulin sensitivity. So it's kind of our job to recognize the first starting points and build the whole protocol from that.
Great, and I'm going to come back to insulin resistance and particularly the metabolism and pitch that to you, Rob. But first, I can't let the phrase personalized nutrition get past us without hearing from Rudy. Rudy, this is something you work closely with every day. Talk to us about personalized nutrition and connect that to longevity.
Very much so. So there's so much tribal thought, as you shared, around what nutritional methodology or what tactics people are going to use day to day to really achieve optimal health or reduce disease risk or increasing their longevity. But really, you need to understand and identify what critical factors you need to fix first, just as exactly in your example, starting with fermented foods and then going to the protein and the fiber. So people need to first understand where they stand and what those risk factors are, and being agnostic essentially to all the different methods of nutrition that are out there and seeing which one should be implemented at that point in time. It's almost as if you have a toolbox. You have a hammer, you have a screwdriver, you have an Allen wrench, you have all the other things. What tool can I utilize right now for what my needs analysis is representing? And then understand that you can go from one camp to another as long as your North Star is still in place. And North Star, for a lot of what we look at for Cenegenics, is lean body mass, recovering from exercise, recovering from just day-to-day stressors in general. And a lot of people fail to reach those protein requirements and fiber requirements. So I'm very much aligned with that.
Okay, and then in terms of connecting that to longevity, where is that connection? You mentioned a North Star.
Yeah.
That sounds to me a lot like living healthy for longer. Yeah. Tie that in.
So I go back to exercise a lot because exercise is really the greatest pill someone can ever take. When we talk about, the varying foods we eat, if we eat all day long or if we're eating certain foods that causes inflammation, it's just a natural response. But exercise yields, not in an acute way, but it is anti-inflammatory. So when we exercise and we improve our health, we're pulling so many levers that are positive for us to improve. So when we look at resistance training, we're going to need protein to recover from that exercise and to fuel the muscle adaptation and to grow muscle. When we do that, we also improve insulin sensitivity, because the more muscle cells we have more glucose disposal at our fingertips, essentially. So by focusing in on some maybe more vague or general ideas like building lean tissue, focusing on your fiber intake, exercising, that's going to have so much impact downstream to impact longevity.
Okay, and you've again talked about insulin. This comes into the discussion a lot. We hear the terms insulin resistance, insulin sensitivity. Rob, can you define that for us and explain after that how important it is to master that for longevity?
Yeah, I think insulin, of course, as people may know, is a master hormone that allows our body to process glucose. And glucose can harm the body through glycation, and also we want to keep the levels down. Glucose tells the body to utilize, insulin tells the body to utilize the glucose and store it in fat and also process it. So glucose is essential for life. Insulin is essential for life. Now, when we get chronically elevated levels of insulin through some dietary factors like certain macronutrients, carbohydrates primarily, stimulate higher levels of insulin because they have glucose and the insulin is required to process the glucose. When we have higher and higher levels of glucose, we get higher and higher levels of insulin. And just like any drug that we're chronically exposed to, we develop resistance to it. So the insulin levels keep going higher and higher and higher like this. And this is driven, the insulin resistance when it crosses a certain point becomes type 2 diabetes. So type 2 diabetes is just insulin resistance once it's reached a high enough level. So insulin resistance and inflammation, in my opinion, are really the primary drivers of aging and also the diseases of longevity. The cardiovascular disease we talked about, the cancer we talked about, and the Alzheimer's disease, inflammation, insulin resistance is primary for all of those. So when I look at dietary approaches or nutritional approaches, I'm looking to reduce the inflammation and reduce the insulin resistance. Even the drug things we talked about with mTOR with rapamycin, you're turning down inflammation, you're turning down insulin resistance as well. But for the nutritional approaches for this, what I do, the 4 steps basically, eating anything at all, no matter what kind of food it is, drives inflammation because it forces proteins through our guts, foreign material. The body's natural response is to respond with inflammation to protect the body. So eating all the time drives inflammation. So like we talked about, first thing you can do is stop snacking and maybe cut down your meals, narrow the eating window. That will decrease inflammation. And then the last things I do are just the three things that I avoid in my diet that drive inflammation are sugars, starches, carbohydrates, which are the primary drivers of insulin. So I minimize those in my diet. And then seed oils, which also are processed industrial oils, things like vegetable oil, canola oil that we used to be told were very healthy, but they're, in my opinion, actually are not. They drive inflammation. And then the final thing is grains. Grains have proteins in them like gluten, and some people have celiac disease and they're allergic to gluten, but even people who are not allergic to gluten can develop inflammation related to other proteins in grains, even whole grains. So for that reason, I avoid all grains altogether.
Rob, I would like to build up on this. So first of all, celiac disease is gluten intolerance, not allergy. But right. I think that's, yeah, okay.
Thank you.
But you mentioned mTOR. So what I noticed recently is kind of a shift in the opposite direction. So a lot of people are actually doing intermittent fasting, 1 meal a day, low carb diets, and they're exercising a lot, which can actually, all of these things are potentially activators of autophagy in a way, and activators of catabolism in the organism. And I see this shift towards the catabolism. Before, we had just anabolism, which is driven by the activation of mTOR, which is very pro-inflammatory. But now people are getting more conscious and shifting the balance towards the other side. So I have to kind of warn them not to go overboard with the fasting, with the low carbs and so on. So I think balancing and knowing when to activate which pathway is the key.
That's a really good point. And with rapamycin specifically, which is a drug which targets mTOR and turns it down and turns it into the autophagy phase and the catabolic phase, the great fear was people taking rapamycin would have muscle wasting, sarcopenia, and interestingly, that doesn't occur. And they don't know why in the human studies and the animal studies, they haven't seen that. So just shows how little we know about this.
Well, it's really interesting, Rob, because the last thing I want people to do is hear the list you just made and think that that is going to work for them. You've given them a prescription that works for you, and it works for many people. But just to bring some contrast, my blood markers are fantastic, and my biological age is really good, and I eat grains, and I eat a diversity of plants. I even eat meat, right? And I think the key there is that I have a high level of exercise. I have very good insulin function in my body. I'm very insulin sensitive, and my body is ready to perform. And so again, this personalization is really important, and I think we have to acknowledge that. And one of the ways that I knew I could optimize my diet was actually using glycanage. I actually ran a self-experiment where I introduced 30 different types of plants into my diet, and I improved my glycanage by 6 years, dropped the inflammation in my body, and the mechanism that we believe was driving that was familiarizing my immune system with my environment by giving it information from the plants, which actually reduced the inflammation in my body. So again, it's quite complex.
Yeah, I think this is maybe a sign of hormesis happening in your system. So hormesis is exposing yourself to a little bit of inflammation to boost your immune defenses to kind of protect you in the future. And this is the impact that actually plants have. So a lot of people kind of take it and say plants are poisonous, but no, that's not the case. They kind of drive up our immune system in a little while, but that protects us in the future. So this is potentially why we see these benefits of your improved biological age. And I actually have to admit, I use your example a lot in my practice, and I always say, look at Nick, he managed to do that, but let's see what you can do to achieve this. Is it the same path, or should we do something else?
Now, Rudy, I can't let this discussion go too much further without pitching back to you, because we're really getting into personalized nutrition. I imagine you eat fairly differently than Rob does, than I might, right? And you're a pretty healthy guy. You're all over your biomarkers. There's differences between men and women, between everyone really, and what the right answer is. Ground us a bit in that.
Yeah, so using your case as an example, and also using Rob's strategy for himself, is that if you were to eat 1 meal per day and limit your intake to avoid this inflammation, the way you train. For example, in a typical week, how many miles are you putting in running or cycling or swimming? I mean, just you can give an answer. Dozens, right? And if you are not fueling yourself correctly, if the systems don't match up, right? If the input doesn't match the output appropriately, that can yield some system failure, some faults in that system. So you can drive into overtraining, chronic stress. That's going to impact your sleep. That's going to have a cascade effect on all these other markers for longevity. So managing the N of 1 is most appropriate. So in your case, the carbohydrate intake throughout the day frequently needs to be appropriate for that output you have. So you could go 50 grams of carbohydrates, you go 300 grams of carbohydrates, or even beyond that, based on how much output you have. And ultimately, the amount of muscle mass you have and the amount of energy expenditure you have, at the end of the day, you can still drive down fasting glucose levels and fasting insulin levels and manage your hemoglobin A1C very well. But that's in your case. For a lot of individuals that don't train to that intensity and also to that volume week over week, year over year, decade over decade, having more intermittent fasting and really avoiding certain carbohydrates, aside from maybe vegetables and fruit, higher fiber carbohydrates, may be a strong strategy for them because they don't have the output that some people have.
Right, and so I think where we get is we can't say there is one longevity diet. We can't say which longevity diet is the right one for you. It has a lot of factors. Again, it comes back to self-empowerment and building a support team, getting some input. Work with a Synergetics, work with a glycanage, work with some data that can help you inform that, so ultimately you've got those key things right? You've got to have metabolic fitness, insulin sensitivity, low inflammation, diversity, enough protein, know that we're recovering. It's these basics that can guide us on our own journey to discover what a longevity diet is for us, and that's all the further we can take it. All right, well, thank you very much for the enlightening discussion. Really appreciate each of you having some input on this. I'm glad there's a bit of disagreement and tension. That's exactly what we want, because we can't give one answer here. Again, thank you for your time.
Another important topic people will understand after watching the Reverse Longevity series is that it's important to know yourself. What do I mean with it? We have genes, we are using some of our genes, we have a microbiome, we have lots of blood parameters, we know how people function. Knowing that is really driving what we are going to prescribe to individuals to reverse their aging process, and to measuring it after a certain intervention to see if it was successful. So knowing yourself, how your body is functioning, is most important to get the right intervention in, to make the right lifestyle choices, to reverse the aging process, to have a lesser chance in the end to have age-related diseases and to optimize health.
But the other piece too that I don't think is commonly represented is that being in this environment, being in Costa Rica and being in nature, one of the things I like to share is that nature used to be a place that we all lived, and now it's a place that we go visit. Like, oh, I'm going out, I'm going camping for the weekend, or I'm going to the beach, for the holiday weekend. And that's a sense of nature for people. When really nature is around us all the time, it's in our lives. And I feel like if we can be more mindful of our space that we are in, that's gonna then bleed into the mindfulness around how we live our lives, foods that we're consuming, how we are, engaging with the environment, getting outside, being active, and also just, managing our stress levels. Like, it helps give perspective on people's lives, because when we're in a closed box, only talking in a work-related field, all of our problems in our lives feel so huge. But you get to a place like Costa Rica, or you just, even go to a park and just sit down and see everything around you. We are very small in this world, and a lot of those stressors that, do a number to us in our health and stress us out, give us anxiety, they start to feel a lot smaller when you get engulfed in nature and have a much broader perspective.